Well, thank you all for coming to this session on successful seniors housing feasibility projects. My name is Irving Stackpole, and it's my pleasure to present this program to you today. And we're going to have a busy 50 minutes, and then I hope to allow 10 minutes or more for Q&A. I'm going to run around this circle of the key factors for successful seniors housing. These are all strategic. Some have a more tactical bent, but I'm going to cover the fundamental strategies associated with success in this sector. Emily Trask, my associate, is with us, and she's going to be keeping an eye on the Q&A for us. And if you have questions, and I hope you will, if you don't have any questions, I haven't done a very good job of being a provocateur, but please put your questions in the Q&A. If you see a slide that's got some information that's of particular relevance or value to you, you don't have to scramble it or do a screenshot or anything like that. You don't have to try to write it down. We'll send this out. We'll send this package out to you afterward, both with the recording, link to the recording, and the presentation itself. And at the end of the presentation, we continue to improve the bibliography. We've got important publications and articles attached to the program presentation. So what I'd like to do today is run through the complex ecosystem of successful seniors housing, assisted living market feasibility studies. We've been doing these at Stackpole and Associates since 1991. We've done hundreds of them, and we have a really good sense of how the strategic and tactical issues, the factors, have evolved over these years. And I'm going to make some predictions, put on my Karnak the Magnificent hat. I should have one of those. And make some predictions about the future of seniors housing studies, and both supply and demand. Again, we're going to focus on seniors housing. Necessarily, we'll also talk about home health care and nursing homes, as well as hospitals. But the focus of this presentation is about seniors housing. And maybe my computer will respond and I can advance the slides. So while I fiddle with the presentation, here we go. So here's the agenda that we'd like to look at today. Looking at the supply and demand in seniors housing. We're going to look both at the demographic and the psychographic. Demographics counts the demography, counts the people, but the psychographic describes their motivations, inhibitions, and their other characteristics. We'll look at the economics associated with seniors housing. I think most of us, many of us in the audience, understand both the economic factors that are driving demand for these markets, but I'm going to look at them from a macroeconomic point of view, and as well as talk about some specific financial matters. Both the technological and the regulatory factors will have an important role in evaluating the markets for these products, for these solutions. We'll talk about healthcare systems changes, because these are indeed impacting both the supply and the demand for seniors housing services. There's been a remarkable expansion of the concepts around housing in the past 5 years or so, to include housing security as one of the social determinants of health. And indeed, those providers, many of you in the audience, providers in this sector are offering one of the factors in social determinants of health. And this will become even more of a an important dynamic in the years to come for reasons that I'll show. Environmental factors are and are becoming even more important for both psychological acceptance of seniors housing as a solution and as a tenable, viable way to assure the financial longevity and sustainability of our seniors housing projects. And as I've already alluded to, we're going to weave into this conversation significant aspects of consumer demand and their preferences. Preferences are changing, and we'll talk about that in the concept in concert with the demographic and psychographic changes as well. We'll talk a bit about data and analytics, and I'll describe some of the data and some of the analytic tools that are critical for understanding what's happening now and will allow us to predict what's going to occur in the future. And then finally, we'll look at financial models and we'll do a little risk assessment around the financing of seniors housing projects going forward. This overall approach mirrors a very well established and useful template for evaluating projects such as seniors housing and assisted living, which is the PESTLE approach, which looks at political, economic, social, technological, legal, in this case, regulatory, and environmental factors impacting a project. Another similar tool is the SWOT, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, which is often used as a tactical tool to analyze or look at why markets are performing in a particular way. I'm not going to use that tool today. We're going to focus on the PESTLE model, I think. So, as a reminder, there would be no seniors housing market without seniors. We start with the elderly. And many of you who've been to presentations that I've given in the past will recognize this particular diagram. This is a diagram of the live births in the United States from 1910 to 2010. And what I've typically focused on is this dip from right in here, from 1925 to 1945. And what we're going to notice in this particular graph is that in the critical age for consuming elderly services and including seniors housing is 85 years of age. And what we'll notice from this graph is that if you are 85 in 2024, you were born in 1939. And if you look at this graph, you can see that that's the beginning of a very steep uptick in the live births in the United States. And if we go just a little bit further, we can see that in 2030, those born in 1945 have significantly increased. The number of live births in the United States has significantly increased. And this represents or augurs a significant increase in demand for seniors housing solutions in the United States. Now, there's caveats to that. Not every age qualified individual is going to accept the solution of seniors housing. But this is a very good start, considering that since over here on this side of the chart, since 2012, just when the assisted living and seniors housing boom took off, the number of seniors was actually going down, and that led to a lot of disappointed results. Well, here we have a situation where the size of the market is actually increasing. And that demand is at the heart of what we need to look at strategically and tactically in seniors housing. So what is the future ager? What does the future ager look like? Well, demographically, he or she is better educated than prior generations, prior agers, much more diverse. The diversity in the population is remarkable. I'm not going to drill down into it, but trust me, we need to understand ethnic foods if we're going to keep our consumers happy. There's a lot more women, and the ability to pay for the solutions as we have priced them up to this point is really questionable. I'm going to delve into this in greater detail at the end of the session when we look at pricing models and we look at financing and at the economic models associated with these solutions. A lot of the future agers, our future market, a lot of them are employed. They're going to be working and or employed. Now this ALICE, A-L-I-C-E, is an acronym with which we should become familiar, especially those who are just entering their career trajectories in this sector. It means asset limited, income constrained, and employed. And that describes a burgeoning size of a burgeoning proportion of the future agers that our sector will need to employ and need to embrace and serve. Length of occupancy is another factor. In many of our properties, we have seen length of occupancy going down with acuity, illness, sickness, complexity, comorbidities going up. This may continue, but in my opinion, it's going to moderate in many of our buildings, and I'll show you why in a moment. So let's look at the supply of seniors housing products in the United States. And this is courtesy of the National Investment Center. They keep very good data. Their sampling methodology means that their information is biased in a particular way. And I don't mean that in a bad way. It's just because the sampling is done of a particular set, it means that there's bias built into the data. But if you look at the annual inventory growth in the seniors housing market, the majority independent living and majority assisted living, we can see that the rate of annual inventory growth is currently and has been very modest. This is not a surprise. There have been a series of economic shocks, not the least of which, of course, was the pandemic, which basically froze these markets. But there's been a series of shocks in the sector which have constrained the growth of supply in the sector. However, I also want to point out that during this same period, if you'll recall that demographic chart that I put up there, you'll recall that in the same period, 2024 to 2030, the age qualified market, the age qualified demographic is going to grow about 24%. It's going to increase by a full quarter. So we are running behind in terms of supply. And I want to show you this. This came out of a summary report that was done by Axios, who published a blog article that said why housing prices are so high in one graph. And it's pretty compelling. There's still a significant gap in the demand versus supply in housing in the United States. And that is a proxy or a mirror for what's actually occurring in seniors housing markets, and in correlation to that in the assisted living markets as well. On the nursing home side, and this is related to an article that was just published today, I believe, in Modern Healthcare. John Sheridan, my colleague, and I titled the article, "Is this the end of the line for nursing homes?" What's happening in nursing homes is that they're closing, and you say, well, I'm not involved in the nursing home market. Phew, I've dodged that bullet. Well, you haven't, because every change within the ecosystem that seniors housing serves has a direct or indirect impact on the way we provide services or the demand for the services. So what we see happening in nursing homes is that the actual number of nursing home beds is going down, and that's the blue bars on this histogram. And the concentration or the population of persons in those nursing homes with very severe cognitive impairment, neurological deficits, that is to say, Alzheimer's and related disorders, severe cognitive impairments, or very severe neuromuscular disorders. That's the orange line. The concentration of them is going up. And by 2030, 70%, this is prediction, 70% of the population within nursing homes will be represented by individuals with advanced cognitive impairments and or severe neuromuscular disorders. Now, what does that mean? That means that in nursing homes, they're going to get fundamentally sicker and sicker and sicker, which means that the ones who aren't being served in nursing homes, the one who are marginally cognitively impaired, who have marginal neurodegenerative disorders, but who don't have the services available in their homes, they're going to be looking to us to meet those needs, to provide a solution for them. And I would suggest that we need to be prepared for that. Another issue, we all know about this, the direct supply of professional workforce is a severe issue. And again, just today, I published a blog about how the competition between home health agencies and nursing homes for staff is going to worsen the current constraints in the supply of the direct care workforce. So these are also issues with which each of us will need to deal in our marketplaces. The secret supply of workforce in the United States and in the UK is the non-paid workforce, which is substantial. And it's an important feature of the way we meet the demand in our environments. That's more of a tactical issue. I'd be happy to talk with anybody about that offline. We've just published a series of 6 articles that are on our website about workforce issues in the sector. So what I'm suggesting, and the rest of the slides will look to, is that change is really upon us. And change has 2 basic flavors. There's incremental change. Most of us are okay with changing a little bit. We can change a little bit. So it's sort of what we have now, some changes, and I liken that to putting lipstick on the pig. Or change can be fundamental and disruptive that leads to something really new. Well, my suggestion is that incremental change is over, that our sector was rocked by the impacts of COVID. And what it showed us is it showed us what not to do. It showed us to not rely upon 30-year-old HVAC systems. It showed us not to rely on hardline telephone lines, not to rely on faxes, that we need to a profound digital transformation. It showed us what not to rely on. And now we need to move on to fundamental and disruptive change in the sector. I'm going to point to some of that. And why this is so important is the politics. The politics of our sector are only beginning to heat up. I know some of you, perhaps many of you, are keeping track of the new staffing rule in long-term care because many of you are involved in the nursing home business and are going to be severely impacted by this new rule. I would suggest to you that it's only just the beginning, that the political changes that are imminent in our sector will be profoundly difficult to navigate. And we need to borrow, steal, copy, emulate adaptive methods that have been used by other industries, other sectors, completely different industries, in order to adapt and to change. A lot of that's going to build on efficiencies that I'll talk about. But the bottom line is that the United States spends 46% of the OECD average. I'll let you read about OECD, but the 46% of the OECD average on long-term care and 246%, 243% on inpatient and outpatient care. This is driving both economics and politics in ways that we cannot avoid. We cannot simply say, well, that's their problem, because this is all a very bad deal. It's a very bad deal for the social contract between the government and its agencies and the people. We are far out ahead of other nations in terms of what we're spending, and we're not getting value for it. So as I say here, US healthcare is a very bad deal. And the country is going to be, politicians and social agencies are going to be looking for ways to fix it. These are economic factors. So these macroeconomic factors impact demand. And again, my colleague John Sheridan and I have looked at how the economic factors like inflation, the depressions, the economic contractions associated with, so we've looked at these over time. And certainly both nursing home and assisted living enrollment relocations have been impacted by them. It's somewhat of a lagging indicator, but it's also the case with independent living. So as economics get worse, consumers withdraw from engaging with these solutions. The other factor is a willingness to relocate to a congregate care center, whether it's assisted living, independent living that's age qualified, or another type of CCRC or life care community. This willingness to relocate, we always had thought that this, in the past, we thought that this was based on novelty, based on lifestyle. Well, it doesn't appear that that's actually the case. And what's bearing out are other factors associated with psychological access. If you can see yourself living somewhere, if you can see yourself relocating to that community, that appears to be more predictive than what the old factor we used to use when we started this in 1991 were penetration, a metric called penetration. Penetration is the degree to which the age, income, or otherwise qualified population accepts your solution. So penetration acceptance. But it appears as though the higher the penetration, actually the higher the acceptance. So these models need to be dramatically changed. There's also perceived well-being versus actual well-being. The perceived well-being in an economic environment is being borne out today on the political stage, where the economic factors in the United States today appear to be generally very, very good, but the current politicians are being punished because the population perceives the economy is not very good. This also has to do with price point sensitivity and lifestyle trade-offs. All of these issues, perceived well-being versus actual, price point sensitivity, and lifestyle trade-offs, these are all metrics that we measure. Stackpole and Associates measures them in a feasibility study for a new project, or when actively recruited to look at why a particular project isn't behaving the way its developers or owners thought it would. So In the social context, remember we were going to use the pestle model, politics or political, economic, social, technological, legal or regulatory, and environmental. From a social point of view, the question we need to be asking ourselves is how popular is loneliness? Now, it seems like a silly question, but I offer it to you as a strategic way to evaluate your markets because it appears as though loneliness is enormously popular, especially among the elderly. If you look at some of the outstanding work that Dave Grabowski and his colleagues have done at Harvard University, looking at the number of aged individuals, those are people who are 70 or 80 years old and older, living alone in their homes is it's mind-boggling. So that by one pundit predicted that by 2035, 60% of the 80 plus population in America would be living at home alone. That's just amazing. We all know that loneliness and isolation were a critical component of the damage that was done during COVID. And yet we have another epidemic of loneliness and isolation that's hard upon us. We need to address that. And then how popular is congregate care? The sector has, I hope this doesn't offend anybody, but the sector has done a lousy job in positioning itself vis-a-vis living alone, living isolated. And we need to do a better job of making living in congregate settings more popular. And one of the critical ways we're going to do that, if we are successful doing it, and some of my clients are, and I hope some of you are, is by inserting variety. Because as we'll see, the psychographics of the emerging elderly cohort, which is enormous, the psychographic characteristics of this cohort are very different from anything that we've worked with before. And the other question I've put in here is, how well is your solution accepted? That's the penetration question put in a slightly different way. On a technological point of view, we are overall the sector that technology left behind. We are so far behind the curve on technology, technological adaptation and development. I have to say that in many ways, this is a good place to be because we can do a leapfrog. There's actually a company out there called Leapfrog that talks about technological innovation and deployment, which is disruptive and large and not incremental. I'm not talking about putting cabling into a building or fiber internet. I'm talking about the Internet of Things. I want us to be looking quite far into the future at things like remote patient monitoring, remote tools. There's a technology called Range R technology that I'd all like you to look at. It's scary, powerful, and it would allow us to deploy a methodology called ambient assisted living. And this ambient assisted living would tactically provide surveillance, and it has such a negative connotation, doesn't it, when you say surveillance, but I mean it in the most loving way possible. Like a parent sets out a blanket for the child, and if this is patronizing, I'm sorry, the parent sets out the blanket for the child and the toddler and watches to make sure that the toddler doesn't go off the blanket and grab a fistful of gunk and stick it in her mouth that she shouldn't be eating. This ambient assisted living technology is like that. It provides enough tracking to keep the individual safe without the kind of intrusiveness that most adults would find offensive. And if we want to look to how this is done, both well and not so well, I strongly recommend that we set up some Google alerts around Japan, because Japan is showing us how a complex, multidimensional, highly diverse, well, it's not highly diverse, but how this society deals with the burgeoning burden of an aged cohort that's extremely large as a proportion and in numbers. And I want you to pay particular attention to vending machines. It's very entertaining to see the vending machine culture in Japanese society. In a regulatory sense, in the United States, one of the issues that hasn't caught up to seniors housing is zoning. One of the observations we've made just over the past 3 years and the projects that we've done since the pandemic is that towns and cities, municipalities, and even counties are now far more adaptive, far more willing to talk about zoning, flexing the zoning requirements to make certain accommodations to builders, developers, and remodelers so that that school can be repurposed into seniors housing, so that that old mill building can be repurposed, redesigned, or that particular corner lot can be raised and redeveloped into seniors housing. So zoning is looking much more flexible and less of a barrier than it has been in the past. The one obstacle that continues to endure, and it's probably going to for the next 3 to 5 years, are the absolutely labyrinthine and irrationally complicated certificate of need programs around the country. These vary state by state. The handbook associated with managing them is this thick. It's impenetrably complicated, but it's just what we have to deal with. And maybe in your state, maybe if you're in a particularly progressive state or a state where the leadership in the Medicaid or Department of Social Services just fed up with the lack of available supply in suitable or even manageable seniors housing, if they're fed up with it and they want to make profound changes to the certificate of need programs, I'm hats off to you. That's great. Go get it, because we need to change in that regard. The final thing I want to point out here from a regulatory point of view has to do with income qualification. Because there is an unaddressed need in the low to middle markets for consumers who are aging into their comorbidities and their disabilities. Because of this, the income qualification requirements for various programs are changing even as we speak. This is a very good thing overall for society, and it's a very good thing for seniors housing developers. We can take advantage of tax credits. We can take advantage of certain other opportunities within state or county governments to leverage the fact that we as a sector recognize that up to this point, the upper ends of the market, the highest quartile of income earners and asset possessors have been served. And now we're turning our attention properly to the middle market and the low income market. So the income qualification standards for various programs and benefits are also changing. And this is important for our sector. I'd like to turn attention to the changes in the healthcare delivery system and how they're going to impact and how they impact on a marketplace by marketplace basis. We're seeing tremendous impacts by consolidations of healthcare systems on seniors housing providers. Now, the first sector in which this is being felt, has been felt, and will continue to be felt is in assisted living. Because as various waiver programs become more widely accepted and have broader penetration, and as consumers, more consumers, age qualified consumers, are covered by Medicare Advantage plans, which offer some of these some payments associated with services in a qualified assisted living or independent living residence. As these become more and more common, the role of seniors housing in the healthcare ecosystem is going to take on greater and greater importance. And you don't have to look very far to see this coming. These footsteps, we've heard these footsteps coming down the hallway even before the pandemic. These dynamics were referred to as social determinants of health. And housing security is one of those, and how the healthcare consolidation in your market looks at this is tremendously important. Hospitals need to discharge patients. In fact, arguably, it's more important for hospitals to discharge patients than it is to admit them in the first place. Admitting someone earns a hospital a fixed fee or a particular value-based payment, but discharging them guarantees that their costs won't overrun that fixed payment. Those transitions of care need to occur from the hospital to a safe and appropriate environment. As we know, many age-qualified individuals who with multiple comorbidities who are also lower on the socioeconomic scale do not live in environments that are secure, safe, or appropriate. So where are they going to go? Well, we already looked at the data on nursing homes. They're not going to nursing homes. Where are they going? They're going home with home care when they can get home care. There is both pressure and an opportunity, and how this opportunity is accepted is critical for both feasibility and ongoing security in our sector. Is the relationship between seniors housing providers in any given marketplace area, where the mapped out area, the relationship between the seniors housing services providers and the healthcare system. That relationship, which has historically been either benevolently tolerated or ignored, that relationship, we need to pick that relationship up and nurture it carefully and see how and under what circumstances we as seniors housing providers can engage in determining healthy populations of age. This seniors housing can fill an important gap, and I would turn once again to the political issues that are driving strategic change at very high levels. That 246% of the OECD, the United States, spends on healthcare. There's going to be continuing pressure to reduce that. Health systems are consolidating. Data on the consolidation from Kaufman Hall shows that the number of consolidations was aggressive just before the pandemic, slowed down as a result of the pandemic, but is now picking up pace. Hospitals are looking for scale. Hospitals are turning into hospital systems. And what that means for us is that these relationship building needs to occur with a system and as well as with individual hospitals. The environmental factors, political, economic, social, technological, legal, environmental. The environmental factors are incredibly important. There is probably no single more predictive element of the attraction of a product or a service, so the potential detraction to a product or a service. In other words, impact on a brand. There's probably no other factor other than sustainability that's as important right now, other than a scandal or another pandemic or something like that. It's enormously important. Hospitals, if they were taken together, would represent the third or fourth largest polluter in the world. And I'm not sure where seniors housing is. I don't know if anybody wants to do that study. That would be a very interesting study. But the fact is, even if we are not a major, if our carbon footprint isn't massive, any efforts we can make, solar power, wind power, thermal wells. I've got clients that are doing all of these things. And these are very compelling marketing messages, if not to the age qualified consumers themselves, to their adult children and advisors. Tremendously important. Consumer dynamics and preferences are changing. So I say here, not your granny's older housing. Certainly the demand has changed, and the way it's changed is that you can just throw the cookie cutter away. What is going to appeal to a particular age qualified consumer entering her 80s today is not the same as what will appeal to an age qualified consumer who entered her 80s 10 years ago. It's absolutely different. And I'm going to show you one of the models we use for evaluating that and vetting this. So that what we need, without a question of a doubt, is variation. We need variety in what we're offering to the age, income, and otherwise qualified cohorts we're serving. And remember the ALICE model: asset limited, income constrained, but employed. Because we already have, and will continue to have, ALICE consumers entering their 80s and 90s in the United States. And what they're going to need are some very distinct but important supports into their environments. For example, good internet, workstations, transport, and wellness. Not just well washing, but real wellness. Is wellness in your DNA? I participated as a judge with the ICAA for the Beacon Awards associated with wellness programs in seniors housing. And it's just very clear that some seniors housing are really, it's baked into their DNA. And for others, it's lipstick. So is it in your DNA? This is one of the models for evaluating consumers' wants versus needs in psychological or psychometric perspective. And it's an old model, but it still holds up quite well. It's called the Values and Lifestyles Sampling Model. And you see that there are populations that are considered ideal, people who are quote unquote ideals, people who are achievers, people who self-express, and there are others who are believers, strivers, and makers. And based on these, they separate out. And in your marketplace area, for the population that you're going after, how this is important is the messages that you relate to your audience and the way you position your product. So if you're developing your product and you're going after innovators, your product needs to have, and your marketing messaging needs to have a different set of features and images and flavor about it than if you're going after survivors. That audience requires a different set of messaging, a different set of images. And these are important ways to discriminate, identify, and differentiate yourself within your marketplace area. So consumers' wants versus needs is changing. In particular, leading edge boomers who turn 75 now and are in a few years going to be turning 80. And these consumers, these leading edge consumers, will require greater variety than ever before. And what's important, I think, is to communicate variety, not necessarily even physical variety, but psychological, programmatic variety. Not so much variety in the built environment, but variety in the programmatic, psychological, and activities environments. Okay, so we talked also about data and analytics. And of course, a good feasibility study is built on data and analytics. Successful operations are built on good data and analytics. Let me talk just a smidge about these things. Data for feasibility relies upon demographics and estimating and predicting future, relies upon surveys and survey work, both secondary, that is to say, already published by Leading Age, the ASHA, and others, but also surveys that the developer does, surveys among the targeted age, income, and asset qualified individuals in their marketplace area, because they're very different. We've worked all over the United States, and I can tell you that respondents in Utah respond very, very differently from respondents in Connecticut, and different again from respondents in New York, and profoundly different again from respondents in Florida. How the competitors performed. How did the competitors perform when the project down the street was inserted into the marketplace in 2008? How did it do? How did it do in terms of ramping up, leasing up? How was its acceptance? Did it stumble? Did it fill right up? And why? Do we understand why? And that has to do with acceptance and penetration. That's the key. Those are the key sets of issues, data metrics in feasibility analysis. On the operations side, again, surveys, metrics on operating, how efficiently, cost-based accounting, metrics on marketing. How is your lead gen doing? Digital marketing allows us to look at lead gen in a very specific and a very measurable way. It's not just about institutional brand building or recognition and awareness, although those are important, but it also has to do with what's the ROI on those investments, and the metrics on sales. How often, how frequently are we looking at the metrics on sales? Financial models and risk assessments are essential parts of a feasibility analysis. And the first task of this is to define the risk. And the second task is to model it. The risks can include complex and unthinkable things like a pandemic. Who would have thought? But also things like shocks in the economy. I've already talked about the economic shocks that the pandemic brought on. Recessions bring on shocks, economic shocks. There can be political shocks. Changes in governments can have a big impact. Changes in the attitude and approach towards supporting seniors' housing can have a big impact to the positive or the negative. And then how do we model it? How do we estimate those risks in a seniors housing environment? It's essential that we begin to do these projects, and I'd like to see more programming. I'm going to encourage those who are tied in with Leading Age and other organizations to include more risk calculations, to invite actuarials to talk with us about defining risk and modeling risk in our environments. Because if you look at the shocks and the impacts that the shocks have had, the economic, social impacts of them, we haven't done very well so far, and we need to do better.
Irving, we're just at about 10 minutes left, so I just want to...
Great, thank you. I just want to run very quickly through fiscal performance, because this is fiscal performance of feasibility. Historically, we'd have started here, and now you can see that it's at the conclusion. And the pricing model for assisted living has always been pin the tail on the pricing. It's like pin the tail on the donkey. I joke you not. This is what we've done forever, and this is just crazy. It's a crazy way to assign the price for any product or service. There are two ways to approach pricing from the top down, in that you look at what markets could bear, pick a percentage of the marketplace where you want to insert your product, or use reference pricing, or bottom up. What are the costs? What's the total investment? What's the cap rate? Or you can use some model of the two and do price point sensitivity and use that in conjunction with your brand positioning and do a trade-off analysis where you look at various brand positions in relationship to various price points. I'm convinced and have some proprietary data that shows that there's been a lot of money left on the table. And unfortunately, there've also been some poor positioning choices made by providers who have positioned themselves too high in a market and have priced themselves out. Sample pro forma, these are available, widely available. I know you can't read this, but you can grab it off the slide share when you're ready to receive the program. But this is the ecosystem of feasibility in seniors housing and assisted living that I wanted to bring to your attention and try to cover in summarily today. I would urge you all to look at each of these factors in looking at the feasibility. And of course, I would be absolutely delighted to be in contact with any of you to talk further about how these messages can be applied in your particular setting. So this is my contact details are in here. And as I said, there's a very substantial bibliography attached to the program. So when you get the slide deck, scan to the end and you'll be able to pull up the various reports and citations that we used to put this together. And with that, I'd love to hear your questions.
Great. Thank you so much. Please type any additional questions into the chat. I have one. You talked about, obviously, the pandemic highlighting the staffing challenges. With these frameworks, can we address staffing challenges and issues through design technology within seniors housing projects?
Absolutely. What a great question. And yes, indeed. So staffing, keeping the staff you've got. So the critical strategic agenda for every provider of aging care services on a go-forward basis is staff retention. That's the first thing. As I showed in the slide, the data from BLS is very clear. Our market segments have not retained staff, and the staff have not returned. So what that means is that keeping the staff you've got is critical. The water is leaking out of your bucket. You've got to plug the holes in your bucket first. Technology can play and has played in many sectors central role in keeping the staff that you've got. And I would turn our attention to the hotel industry as a model for how they have not only kept staff, but have re-attracted staff. And they've done it through the technological innovations associated with reducing risk. You can work in an environment where you're having to provide a service in a person-to-person environment, but with a technology installed that mitigates the risk of contagion, mitigates the risk that you're actually going to get sick. Some of these technologies are incredibly simple, like washing your hands and wearing masks when it's appropriate. But other technologies are pretty sophisticated, and they help both retain staff by demonstrating reduced risk, and they can position your solution as being technologically more sophisticated than the guy down the street, which gives you a first to market mover advantage. for those individuals who are concerned about this. So yes, and as to that question, we have a series of articles on our website called Staffing SOS, to which I would refer the listener, that cover keeping the people you've got and ultimately attracting others. And technological applications, existing technological applications are woven throughout those articles. I hope that answers the question.
Great. Thank you. We have another question. How should the development of multi-generational housing and telemedicine development affect our thinking?
Well, first of all, let me take telemedicine first. Telemedicine, telehealth really refers to a specific utilization of telemetry for diagnosis and treatment by qualified health professionals. So that's really that's a distinct thing. Remote monitoring is another thing entirely, and that's absolutely where the future is headed. Remote remote technological applications are the future. I saw this coming long ago, along with a couple of other colleagues, and we got a patent from the United States Trademark and Patent Office. There is nothing out there still that's very sophisticated in this realm, and it's just amazing to me. We need to do a better job of surveilling, that's the word, watching, providing ambient solutions for tracking what mom is doing, how healthy she is, and what she's doing. And that's enormously important. So the telemetry is extremely important. Where the sector goes with it depends upon you all, the people who are in the audience today, you all demanding these things from technology providers. And that so far that demand hasn't been there. There was a first part of the question. I got excited about the telehealth telemetry question. What was the first part of the question, Emily?
It was in regard to multi-generational housing.
Oh, this is really, I think this is really interesting. We all like the idea of a little toddler sitting in granny's lap. And it's a great New York Times, front page story. The fact is, the available data shows no real interest in multi-generational housing. That is to say, different age groups living together, cohabiting in the same space. There's a very good article about this that was published in Canada, a very good scoping article that showed that after a reasonable period of time, in dozens of these places, which included thousands of people, that afterwards just about everybody said, including the old people, we wouldn't do this again. So I think we need to look at it carefully. Is it an activity that somehow for promotional purposes or a diversionary purposes, or is it really baked into the DNA of the program? If you're a LaSalle Village, for example, are you really baking the DNA of education, which means you're going to have younger people and older people together, into your program? So the data on the mixed multi-generational stuff is quite mixed. Are there any other questions that we can handle quickly, Emily?
Sure, I have one more.
Okay.
Can these frameworks that you discussed be adapted to consider the specific needs of urban versus suburban senior housing markets?
Absolutely. And those are critical distinctions. Every marketplace area has distinct markets. The markets in urban Illinois and Wisconsin are very different, or Texas, are very different from the markets in and around Baltimore, or in and around Boston, or in and around Los Angeles. Profoundly different. And they absolutely have to be adapted to and taken into consideration in doing these feasibility studies and market analysis. Well, I want to thank you all for your patience and thank you all for your time. And again, over the next day or two, you'll get the obligatory email from us, but do connect with me on LinkedIn and get active in these topics. It's important for us and it's important for the future. Really appreciate your time and look forward to your participation in the future. Thank you.